One unexpected hug from a disabled boy changed a waitress's life forever, and what she did next left even a billionaire speechless. It was a quiet Tuesday afternoon when Robert, a successful billionaire and single father, decided to take his 8-year-old son Eli out for a simple lunch. Despite owning multiple businesses, luxury cars, and even a private jet, Robert believed in keeping his son grounded. Eli had been born with a neurological condition that made his motor functions slower than other kids his age. He couldn't speak clearly, sometimes used a wheelchair, and often expressed himself through touch, especially hugs. Robert had grown used to the way people stared at them in public, the way conversations would stop when Eli made noises or moved. Unexpectedly, this time, something different was about to happen. They drove to a small, boozy cafe in a part of town that Robert didn't usually visit. He had heard about the place from his driver, who had mentioned that the food was great and the atmosphere was peaceful. It wasn't one of those fancy high-end places Robert usually went to for business meetings. This cafe had a warmth, too. It had a local charm with wooden furniture, handwritten menus, and the smell of fresh coffee in the air. It reminded Robert of simpler times before the wealth, the fame, and the constant pressure of his corporate life. When they entered, the bell above the door chimed softly, and a few customers looked up before returning to their meals. A young waitress, maybe in her mid-20s, walked over with a kind but tired smile. Her name tag read Sophie. She had tired eyes, worn-out sneakers, and a notepad in hand. She greeted them politely and led them to a quiet corner table. Eli, as always, looked around with innocent curiosity. His head moved slowly as he took in the details, the twinkling fairy lights near the windows, the potted plants, the old radio playing soft music. Robert helped him into his seat, placing the wheelchair aside. Sophie handed them the menus and gave a soft smile to Eli, who smiled back in his own unique way by gently tapping his hand on the table twice and reaching out with his arms. Robert noticed the gesture immediately. It was Eli's way of saying he liked someone. "Would you like a hug?" Robert said softly, translating for his son. Sophie looked surprised. She hesitated for a second, unsure what to do. Most people in her position would just laugh nervously or ignore it. But Eli had already stood up, his legs wobbly but determined. He reached out and wrapped his arms around Sophie's waist. His head resting gently against her apron, Sophie froze. It wasn't a rude kind of freeze, it was a moment of surprise, perhaps even discomfort. She wasn't expecting it. She hadn't been warned. And in that split second, the whole cafe seemed to fall into silence. The spoon clinking stopped. The music faded into the background. Even Robert, who had seen this happen many times, felt unsure of what was going to happen next. Eli held on for a little longer, completely unaware of the awkwardness around him. For him, hugging was a way of connecting with the world. He couldn't always speak his thoughts, but he could feel people's energy, and he gave love freely. It didn't matter if they were strangers. He sensed something kind in Sophie, and his heart responded before his mind could. Sophie looked down slowly. Her body was still stiff, her hands still holding the notepad. Her eyes darted to Robert, unsure if she was doing something wrong. But Robert didn't stop his son. Instead, he watched silently, giving her space to choose her response. His face didn't carry the usual billionaire arrogance. It showed something deeper, hope. He had brought Eli out not just for lunch, but for experiences. He wanted people to see his son, not his money. And in moments like this, he saw the true character of those around him. Sophie's fingers twitched slightly. Her lips parted as if to say something, but no words came out. She had served hundreds of customers before, cleaned up after noisy kids, smiled through bad tips, and dealt with rude behavior, but never had someone just hugged her out of nowhere, purely because they felt like it. Eli's hug was innocent, soft. It didn't ask for anything. It just gave, and slowly Sophie's shoulders relaxed. She didn't step back or push him away. Her hands came up awkward at first and then gently rested on Eli's back. She didn't squeeze tightly, but she held him enough to let him know she was there. The notepad dangled loosely from one hand. Her eyes were still wide, but they had softened. A tiny smile touched the corners of her lips. Robert exhaled quietly. The moment didn't last more than 10 seconds, but it felt like a lifetime. In that span of time, Sophie had made a decision. She didn't choose comfort or distance. She chose connection. She chose kindness. When Eli finally let go, he looked up at her with a beaming smile. His body wobbled a little, but Robert quickly stood up to support him. Sophie looked at Eli, then at Robert. Her voice was a little shaky as she said, "He's sweet." Robert nodded, his heart full. "He is. Ain't you kind for accepting that hug?" "Most people don't." Sophie looked down, brushing some hair behind her ear. "It just caught me off guard. I wasn't expecting it." "Understand," Robert replied gently. "He doesn't always ask first." Sophie gave a small laugh, almost nervous. But it wasn't a laugh of discomfort anymore. It was a laugh that acknowledged the unusual, this beautiful moment that had just occurred. She took their order, her voice warmer now. She crouched a bit while talking to Eli, making eye contact, trying to understand his gestures. She asked Robert questions about what Eli could eat and how spicy he liked his food. She wasn't just doing her job, she was trying to connect other. Customers eventually returned to their meals, and the normal sounds of the cafe resumed. But for Robert, something had shifted. In those few minutes, he had seen something rare. He had seen a young woman freeze not out of coldness, but out of uncertainty, and then melt into compassion. And that to him meant more than any polished smile or well-trained customer service. He watched Sophie move from table to table, still writing orders, still rushing from the kitchen to the front counter. But every time she passed by their table, she glanced at Eli, offering a smile or a wave. And Eli, in his own way, responded with tiny claps or playful nods. A silent friendship had been born. Robert sat back in his chair, sipping his coffee, and watching his son's face light up with joy. It was a simple lunch, yet it felt like something more, something magical. What made it special wasn't the food, the cafe, or even the wealth Robert carried in his wallet. Freely, received hesitantly, and accepted wholeheartedly. A hug that crossed the lines of social class, health, and familiarity. And it all started because one disabled boy trusted a stranger with his heart. Robert didn't say it out loud, but inside he was already thinking, this young waitress, she was different. Not because she was perfect, but because in a world that often recoiled from discomfort, she chose to lean in with love. Sophie walked back to the kitchen with the order pad still shaking slightly in her hand. Her heart was beating faster than usual, and her mind replayed the moment Eli hugged her again and again. She had never experienced anything like it before. In all her years of working at the cafe, no customer had ever reached out like that, especially not a child with such innocence and trust. The hug had surprised her so much that she didn't know how to react at first. It wasn't that she didn't like it. She was just stunned, frozen in that moment between wanting to act kindly and not knowing if she should, as she leaned against the counter, waiting for the kitchen staff to prepare the food. She tried to process what had just happened. The boy, Eli, had something incredibly gentle about him. His movements were slow, his eyes wide and kind, and the way he reached out to her had no hesitation. He hadn't feared rejection. He hadn't even waited for her approval. He just walked into her personal space and offered a hug. Most people would call it strange or inappropriate, but Sophie couldn't find anything wrong with it. In fact, the more she thought about it, the more it warmed her heart. She wasn't used to such moments. Life had been tough. She had been working double shifts at the cafe just to pay rent and take care of her little brother at home. Their parents had passed away in an accident a few years ago. Since then, Sophie had taken on the role of both sister and guardian. Her world had become all about responsibility, work, and survival. There was no room for softness or vulnerability. She had to be strong all the time. But that little boy's hug had pierced right through the armor she wore every day. She peeked around the kitchen wall and looked at the corner table. Robert was helping Eli drink from a straw, gently wiping the corners of his mouth with a napkin. There was a calmness in their corner, a sort of quiet beauty in how the father cared for his son. It was clear that Robert adored Eli, the way he looked at him, The way he responded to every gesture with patience, it told Sophie everything she needed to know about the man. She had no idea he was a billionaire. To her, he looked like just another man trying to raise a child with special needs. And in that moment, that's all she saw. As she returned to their table with the drinks, Sophie noticed her own hands were still a little unsteady. She placed the glasses down gently, trying not to let it show. Eli looked up at her and smiled, clapping his hands softly. Sophie smiled back and crouched next to him. "Do you like apple juice?" she asked softly. Eli didn't answer in words, but he reached out and patted her hand. It was his way of saying yes. Robert watched silently, his eyes observing everything with quiet appreciation. "He does," Robert said. "He likes people who are kind." Sophie felt her cheeks flush. It had been a long time since someone said something like that to her. Kind. Was she still kind? Life had hardened her in many ways. She often had to pretend to be tough so customers wouldn't take advantage of her. But maybe, just maybe, she hadn't lost that part of herself. As she stood up, she found herself lingering a little longer than usual. She didn't rush away from their table. Something about the way Eli looked at her made her want to stay. It wasn't like he wanted anything, he was just happy that she was there. That small, genuine connection felt strangely healing. In the kitchen, her coworker Dave nudged her and said, "That kid likes you, huh?" Sophie smiled and shrugged. "Yeah, he gave me a hug." Dave raised an eyebrow. "A hug? Seriously?" Sophie nodded out of nowhere. "Just hugged me." "Did the dad say anything?" "No. He just watched. I think he was curious how I'd react." Dave shook his head. "Weird. I would have freaked out." Sophie didn't respond. It was weird. She thought it was beautiful. Back at the table, Robert was quietly thinking. He had seen the hesitation in Sophie's face when Eli hugged her. I'd also seen how she had slowly allowed herself to accept it. That moment had told him everything. About her character? It wasn't about how quickly she responded. It was about the choice she made when faced with the unexpected. Most people either step back, reject, or fake a smile. Sophie had done none of those. She had taken a breath, embraced the awkwardness, and chosen love. That, to Robert, meant more than anything money could buy. As the food arrived, Sophie carefully placed the dishes in front of them. She even cut Eli's pancake into small pieces without being asked.
Oh.
Robert watched her silently. He was used to being served. Waiters, assistants, staff, they all treated him with respect. But very few showed the same level of care Sophie had shown Eli in just a few minutes. "Do you have kids?" Robert asked gently. Sophie was caught off guard. "Me? No. But I take care of my younger brother. He's 12. Robert nodded. "You're good with children?" Sophie smiled but didn't say anything. Praise wasn't something she was used to. She simply brushed her apron and said, "Let me know if you need anything else." As she walked away, Eli waved at her. She turned and waved back, this time with more confidence. The hesitation from earlier was fading. She no longer felt unsure around him. She had connected to something pure and untouched, something she hadn't felt in a long time, but deep down, Sophie couldn't help but wonder why this moment had affected her so deeply. It was just a hug, wasn't it? Just a moment in a long, tiring day. And yet, it had left a mark on her heart. The truth was, Sophie hadn't been hugged in years, not genuinely at least. Her little brother was going through his own teenage struggles and barely showed affection. Most of her adult life was filled with customers who didn't even look her in the eye. Bosses who barked orders and people who came and went, but Eli's Huggett had been different. It was real, unfiltered. He didn't care about her appearance, her tired eyes, her messy hair, or her worn-out shoes. He just felt her presence and wanted to share love. Later that day, as her shift neared its end, Sophie found herself checking their table more often than necessary. She offered to refill their drinks, brought napkins, and even offered Eli a small chocolate from behind the counter. Robert accepted politely, but said, "You don't have to go out of your way. You've already done more than enough." Sophie shook her head with a soft smile. "I don't mind. Robert could see it. Wasn't being nice for a tip. This was genuine. She had been moved by the moment as much as they had. As the cafe grew busier, Sophie returned to her other tables. But her mind kept returning to Eli. She couldn't explain why, but something inside her felt lighter. That one small act of unexpected connection had opened a door in her heart. She had spent so long being strong, responsible, and tired that she had forgotten what it felt like to just be human. When Robert finally asked for the bill, Sophie brought it over, but he didn't look at it. Instead, he asked her one simple question. "Why didn't you pull away?" Sophie looked at him, confused. "What do you mean?" "When my son hugged you," Robert said. "You were surprised?" "I saw that. Most people pull away. But you didn't. You hesitated, but you stayed. Why?" Sophie took a moment to think. "I guess. I didn't want to hurt him. He wasn't doing anything wrong. He just wanted to share something. And I guess I needed that moment too." Robert looked at her for a long time. Then he said something that would stay with Sophie forever. "You have no idea how rare that is." With that, he paid the bill, leaving a generous tip, and gathered Eli's things. Eli waved goodbye, and Sophie bent down to hug him again. This time, she didn't hesitate at all. As they walked out, Sophie stood by the door and watched them leave. Her chest felt full. Love what? She wasn't sure. Hope, maybe. Healing, possibly. But definitely something good. She didn't know who Robert was. She didn't know how rich he was, or what kind of life he lived outside the cafe. All she knew was that something meaningful had happened, something that would change everything, not just for her, but for him too. And she was right. Because what happened next would surprise her more than she could ever imagine. The soft jingle of the cafe's doorbell faded as Robert and Eli stepped outside. The cool breeze touched their faces, and Robert wrapped Eli's jacket tighter around him before helping him into the wheelchair. But even as they moved through the parking lot, Robert's thoughts remained inside the cafe with the young waitress who had just changed the direction of his day. Maybe even something more. Inside the cafe, Sophie returned to her routine, but she was not the same. Something had shifted within her. Her hands still poured coffee in balanced trays, but her heart was far away. That brief connection with Eli, so small, yet so powerful, kept playing in her mind. The boy's hug, the warmth in his eyes, the way he looked at her without judgment or expectation, it had made her feel seen. And when Robert had asked her why she hadn't pulled away, she had answered truthfully. It wasn't planned, and it wasn't out of duty. It had simply come from a place deep inside her, a place that she had forgotten still existed. A few hours later, as the cafe started to wind down for the evening, Sophie stood by the counter, rolling silverware into napkins and stacking menus. The tiredness of the day finally caught up to her, but her heart was strangely light. She looked at the empty corner where Robert and Eli had sat, and for a second, she smiled quietly to herself. She didn't know that Robert was still thinking about her too. That evening, Robert sat in his study at home, watching Eli play with his toys on the carpet. Usually, Robert would be buried in paperwork or on calls with business partners, but not tonight. Tonight, he couldn't focus on stocks or meetings. He kept thinking about Sophie. He had seen many things in his life. He had met presidents, CEOs, and world leaders. He had walked through the most expensive hotels, flown in private jets, and attended events with the most famous people. But none of that had touched his heart the way Sophie had in those few minutes. Her reaction wasn't fake. It wasn't forced. It was real. Robert had built his empire by reading people. He could tell when someone wanted something from him, money, opportunity, power. But Sophie hadn't wanted anything. She had given kindness without expectation. And in doing so, she had given something rare and beautiful to his son, acceptance. Later that night, as Eli drifted off to sleep, Robert stood by the window, watching the city lights. He thought about how much his son struggled to connect with others. How many times people had avoided him, changed seats, or stared at him with pity or discomfort. Robert could handle a lot in life, but watching his son get rejected again and again, it crushed him every time. That was why Sophie's small act meant so much. The next morning, Sophie woke up early, as always. She cooked breakfast for her little brother, packed his school bag, and made sure he had everything he needed. He barely said thank you, like most teenagers, but she didn't mind. She had gotten used to doing things without expecting praise. After he left for school, Sophie grabbed her coat and headed toward the cafe for another long shift. The cafe was quiet when she arrived. She greeted the manager, put on her apron, and got to work setting the tables. But something unusual happened. That morning, around 10 o'clock, a man in a black suit walked in, looked around, and then walked directly to the counter. "Are you Sophie?" he asked politely. She blinked in confusion. "Yes, can I help you?" He handed her a plain white envelope. "Mr. Robert Hartley asked me to deliver this to you." Sophie stood frozen, her hands trembling slightly as she accepted the envelope. Robert Hartley. The name sounded familiar, but she couldn't place it right away. The man in the suit nodded respectfully and walked out without another word. Sophie stared at the envelope. Her name was written neatly on the front. She looked around, unsure whether to open it right away. Her heart pounded as she carefully tore it open. Inside was a letter and a card. The card was simple. It had Robert's full name on it, Robert Hartley, chairman and CEO of Hartley Industries. Her breath caught. She had served a billionaire. The letter was handwritten, not typed. That surprised her. Someone like him could have asked an assistant to send an email, or even just do nothing. But he had taken the time to write. The letter read, "Dear Sophie, I wanted to thank you personally for what you did yesterday. I know it might have seemed like a small moment to you, but it meant the world to my son and to me. Eli doesn't. Always get welcomed with warmth. People often hesitate, or worse, turn away. But you didn't. You accepted his hug, and you gave him love without fear or discomfort. You didn't know who I was, and that made your kindness even more genuine. I watched the way you treated Eli, not just with patience, but with care. That's not something we see often in the world, especially from strangers. I believe that people like you, people with kind hearts, deserve more in life. So I'd like to invite you to lunch. No pressure, no obligation, just a conversation. If you're open to it, I'd love to know more about your story. With gratitude, Robert Hartley. Sophie sat down slowly on a stool behind the counter. Legs felt weak. She couldn't believe what she was reading. Her mind raced. A billionaire. A personal letter. An invitation to lunch. This wasn't real. Things like this didn't happen to people like her. She folded the letter and slipped it into her pocket, her heart still racing. She didn't tell anyone. She needed time to think. For the rest of the day, Sophie moved like she was floating. Every time the door opened, her heart jumped, thinking maybe Robert would walk in again. But he didn't. Still, she knew he had reached. I'll tan now. It was up to her. That night after dinner, Sophie sat at her small kitchen table, rereading the letter for the third time. Her brother glanced over her shoulder. "Who's that from?" he asked, mouthful of cereal. Sophie hesitated, then replied, "Just someone I met at work." He shrugged and went back to his game, unaware that his sister's life might be about to change forever. Sophie didn't sleep much that night. Her mind was full of questions. Why had Robert invited her? What would she say if she met him again? What did he really want? She wasn't used to this kind of attention. She'd always kept her head down, worked hard, and stayed invisible. Someone powerful had noticed her, not for her appearance or her mistakes, but for her heart. The next morning, she wrote a short reply and delivered it to the return address on the envelope. "Dear Mr. Hartley, thank you for your kind letter. I'm still not sure what to say, but I'd be happy to meet you for lunch. Sincerely, Sophie." She kept it short. She didn't want to sound too excited or too nervous. But deep inside, her emotions were a storm. What would he say? What would he want to know? 3 days later, another note arrived at the cafe. This time, it was an invitation to a restaurant, classy, but not overly formal. It was clear Robert had chosen a place where Sophie would feel comfortable. On the day of the lunch, Sophie wore her nicest blouse and tried to tame her curly hair. She didn't have fancy clothes or expensive perfume, but she walked into the restaurant with quiet confidence. Robert was already there, dressed in a navy blue suit, sipping tea. When he saw her, He stood up with a warm smile and said, "Sophie, thank you for coming." She smiled shyly and shook his hand. "Thank you for inviting me." They sat down, and for the next hour, they talked not about business, not about money, but about life. Robert asked about her childhood, about her brother, about how she ended up working at the cafe. Sophie answered honestly. She told him about losing her parents, raising her brother alone, and working long hours just to keep things going. Robert listened carefully. He didn't interrupt. He didn't act superior. He simply listened with real attention, the way very few people ever had. And then Robert told her about Eli, about how hard it had been to raise him alone. It's about how people treated him differently, about how that one hug at the cafe had meant. More than most people could understand, Sophie was quiet for a moment and then said, "He reminded me what love feels like. That kind of love. It's rare." Robert nodded. "'Tis," and you gave it to him without hesitation. At the end of the lunch, Robert looked at her seriously and said, "Sophie, I don't know exactly what your dreams are, but if there's any way I can help you, education, career, or even something small, I want to." Sophie stared at him, speechless. He continued, "This isn't about charity. This is about investing in someone with a good heart." And that was the moment everything changed. Because kindness real, pure kindness had spoken louder than money, status, or power. And Sophie, a tired waitress with a soft heart, had touched the life of someone who had everything, except the kind of connection she had so freely given. Sophie walked home from the restaurant with her hands in her coat pockets and her mind full of thoughts. The lunch with Robert had felt like something from a dream, calm, respectful, and somehow life-changing. She kept hearing his words in her mind again and again. "If there's any way I can help you, I want to." No one had ever said anything like that to her before. And not just because he was rich or powerful, but because he truly meant it. That night, she sat at the kitchen table staring at her old notebook where she had once written her goals when she was still in high school. Become a teacher, get a college degree, travel, write a children's book. Most of those dreams had been pushed far away the day her parents died. Since then, she had been stuck in survival mode, working to pay rent, making sure her little brother went to school, cooking, cleaning, and doing everything alone. Her dreams had been buried under piles of bills, tears, and exhaustion. But now, someone was offering to open a door for her. Not out of pity, but because he had seen something in her, a kindness, strength, a spark that even she had forgotten she had. The next day, Sophie went back to work at the cafe. Everything looked the same tables, same counter, same tired walls, but it didn't feel the same. It was like something inside her had changed. For the first time in a long while, she had hope. Not just the kind that whispers in your heart at night, but the kind that stands up and says, maybe life doesn't have to stay this way. Robert didn't call her right away, and she didn't expect him to. She didn't want to seem like she was waiting for anything. But 4 days later, another envelope arrived. Inside it was a note from Robert, written in his own handwriting, just like before. Dear Sophie, I've been thinking about our conversation. You mentioned once wanting to go to college, but putting it off for your brother's sake. I've made some arrangements. There's a local college nearby with a flexible evening program. If you're interested, the tuition is covered. No strings attached. Just your choice. And if you need help with your brother during your classes, I've arranged for a trusted mentor to assist him with homework a few times a week. I'm not doing this as a favor. I'm doing this because the world needs more people like you in it, doing more than just surviving. Let me know what you decide. Robert. Sophie sat in silence for a long time. Her hands trembled as she held the letter. Her throat tightened. This couldn't be real. This kind of kindness, this level of generosity, just didn't happen to people like her, and yet it was happening. Later that evening, she told her brother about it. He didn't say much at first, just listened as he ate dinner. You'd be gone more, he said quietly. Only in the evenings, Sophie replied, and someone will help you with homework. It's a good program. I could be a teacher just like I always wanted. Her brother stared at his plate. What if I don't want someone else around? Sophie sighed, her heart aching. I've done everything for you. I've given up so much. I'm not asking for much. Now just a few hours a day so I can study." He looked up at her, eyes softening. Okay. That one word was all she needed. A week later, Sophie stood outside the college campus, holding a folder full of papers, class schedules, and student ID forms. Her heart was racing. She hadn't walked through a school hallway in years. She had forgotten what it felt like to carry books, to sit in a classroom, to be surrounded by people chasing dreams instead of tips. The first few weeks were hard. She worked at the cafe during the day and went to class in the evenings. She barely slept. She missed dinner with her brother some nights. She had to borrow his old backpack to carry her books, but something inside her had lit up. She had a purpose again. Every time she felt tired, she thought about Eli's hug, about the way he looked at her with pure trust, about the way Robert had believed in her when no one else did. Robert checked in once in a while, not too much, not in a controlling way. Just a short message now and then. "How are the classes? Need anything? Proud of you?" Sophie found those messages comforting. They reminded her she wasn't alone. Sometimes she would go over to Robert's house on weekends. She didn't know exactly how it started, but one Saturday he invited her and her brother over for lunch. She was nervous. Of course, his house was huge, beautiful, full of art and books and things she'd never imagined owning. But it didn't feel cold or fake. It felt like a home. Eli greeted her with the same smile and gentle clapping he had shown the first day. Sophie knelt and hugged him again, this time with no hesitation. He curled into her like she was family. Her brother, too, began to enjoy the visits. He played games with Eli, watched movies in the large home theater, and opened up in a way he hadn't done in months. Over time, a strange but wonderful bond began to grow between them all. Sophie and Robert had long conversations about parenting, about life, about how hard it was to keep going sometimes. She opened up to him in a way she never had with anyone. He listened with the kind of attention she had always wished someone would give her. And slowly, she began to feel something stronger than just gratitude. Robert, too, was changing, he found himself laughing more, watching movies with Sophie and the kids, making pancakes on Sundays. He had been lonely for a long time, even if he hadn't admitted it. His wealth had kept people at a distance, but Sophie never treated him differently. Because of his money, she teased him when he burned toast. She rolled her eyes when he tried to fold laundry the wrong way. He loved it. One evening after dinner, Sophie was helping Eli with a puzzle. Robert watched them from across the room, something soft and unspoken in his eyes. "You've brought a new kind of light into this house," he said quietly. Sophie looked up, surprised. "Me?" He nodded. You and your brother. Your laugh. Your patience. The way Eli smiles when you're around." Sophie blushed. "I didn't do anything special. You were just yourself," Robert said. "That's what made it special."
What?
It was a silence between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was full of emotion of things. Neither of them was ready to say out loud yet, but they both felt it. Something was blooming. As weeks turned into months, Sophie's life began to transform. She passed her classes with high marks. The college teachers praised her for her discipline and insight. She made friends with other students who had also come back to school after difficult lives. And the cafe. Well, she still worked there, but now with a different kind of pride. Not just to survive, but because it had been the place where her new journey had started. People in town began to notice changes in her. She smiled more, she carried books, her clothes looked newer. Some coworkers whispered about her rich boyfriend, but Sophie didn't let the gossip bother her. She knew what was real, and what was real was the quiet strength she had found in herself. What had started with a child's hug had become something far bigger.
Ow.
It had become a new chapter in her life, a chapter full of choices, chances, and change. She was no longer the waitress who went unnoticed. She was the woman who had been seen, who had been trusted, and who had decided to rise. One night as she walked out of class with her books in her arms and the cool wind on her face, she stopped for a moment under a street lamp. She looked up at the sky full of stars and whispered, "Thank you." Not just to Robert, not just to fate, but to herself, for not pulling away, for holding on, and for believing. Even when life had given her every reason not to, She didn't know what the future would hold. But she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going back to the life she had before. Not ever again. Because now, she had tasted what it felt like to be valued, to be lifted, to be loved. And that was just the beginning. After months of hard work, Sophie's life had changed in ways she never thought possible. From the quiet waitress who barely smiled, she had blossomed into a confident young woman, full of hope and dreams again. Her days were busy, balancing college classes, part-time work, and taking care of her brother. But now everything felt different. She felt like she was moving forward, not just surviving. Robert watched these changes with quiet pride. What had begun as a chance meeting had grown into a deep friendship and something more tender and special. He admired Sophie's strength, her kindness, and the way she never let her past define her future. It wasn't just about helping someone in need. It was about connecting with a person who reminded him of the simple joys life could bring. One afternoon, Robert invited Sophie and her brother to a special event at his company's community center. It was a gathering to celebrate local heroes, people who had made a difference in the neighborhood. Robert's invitation surprised Sophie. Why would I go to something like that? She wondered. But when she arrived, she saw familiar faces, teachers, volunteers, and neighbors all sharing stories about kindness, courage, and hope. Robert took the stage and spoke about people who gave more than money. He talked about those who gave time, love, and support to others. Then, to Sophie's astonishment, he called her forward. This young woman, he said, showed me the true meaning of kindness. Her heart and spirit have inspired me and many others. The crowd applauded warmly. Sophie's cheeks flushed, and she glanced at Robert, who smiled gently. In that moment, she realized that her life had come full circle, from a lonely waitress to a community inspiration. That evening, as the crowd thinned, Robert and Sophie talked quietly outside the hall. You've changed so much, he said. And I'm proud of you, Sophie smiled. I couldn't have done it without you. No, Robert replied. You did it yourself. I just helped open a door. Her brother tugged at her sleeve, holding a small box. Open it, he urged with excitement. Inside was a simple necklace with a tiny heart pendant. For you, her brother said, because you never gave up on us. Tears welled in Sophie's eyes. This journey had not been easy, but moments like this made every struggle worth it. As weeks passed, Sophie graduated from her college program with honors. She landed a teaching job at a local school where she inspired children just as she had once hoped. Every day, she carried the lessons of kindness, courage, and perseverance that had shaped her path. Robert continued to be a close friend and supporter. Their bond grew deeper, built on mutual respect and understanding rather than wealth or status. He introduced Sophie to more opportunities, encouraging her to dream bigger. And she did, writing children's stories, volunteering, and even planning trips she had only dreamed of before. Their story became a reminder to everyone around them that kindness can change lives, sometimes in the smallest moments. A hug, a letter, a simple act of acceptance. These could spark hope where there was none. Sophie often thought back to that day in the cafe, when Eli's hug froze the room. It was a moment that had seemed ordinary, but was anything but. It was the start of everything, a new beginning filled with love, growth, and endless possibility. And as she looked ahead, she knew that no matter what challenges came next, she had the strength to face them. Because she had learned the power of kindness and the courage to believe in herself. Her journey had taught her that true wealth wasn't in money or status, but in the hearts we touch and the love we give, and that was the greatest gift of all.